I don't think I'll ever forget that night. I was in Thailand for a work trip, first time there, and I had a flight to catch at some ungodly hour. I thought I'd save a little money and take one of those shared taxis to the airport instead of calling a private cab. In hindsight, worst decision of my life. When the car pulled up, the driver, a guy in his late 40s with a round face and an oversized grin, looked friendly enough. His English wasn't perfect, but we managed to communicate the basics. Airport, right? You sit. Cheap ride, he said, flashing me a thumbs up. I climbed in, and there were no other passengers yet. That should have been my first red flag, but I didn't think much of it. The first few minutes were fine. The streets were quiet, dimly lit, and the occasional motorbike zipped past. I was checking my phone, zoning out, when the guy broke the silence. "You traveling alone?" he asked casually. I told him yes, without looking up. "No family. No one knows you're here," he added. That's when I felt something shift, like the air got heavier. I looked up from my phone. No, I've got friends waiting for me," I lied. His grin faded slightly, and he nodded, muttering something under his breath. That's when I noticed we weren't on the main road anymore. The neon signs and crowded stalls had disappeared, replaced by long stretches of dark, empty highway. My stomach dropped. "Hey, isn't the airport the other way?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his grin now gone completely. "Shortcut," he said, his tone flat. I wasn't buying it. I opened my GPS and saw we were heading in the opposite direction of the airport. My heart started racing. "Pull over," I said, louder this time. He didn't even flinch. I reached for the door handle, but it didn't budge. Child locks. Panic started to creep in. I said, "Let me out." I yelled. He chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down my spine, and said, "Relax. I know where we're going." At that moment, I realized I needed to act fast. I opened my phone and sent my live location to my friend Mark back home, typing, "Something's wrong. Call police. Thailand." My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to hit send. I didn't know if he'd even see it in time. The car slowed down and turned onto a dirt path surrounded by trees. It was pitch black outside, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires. My mind was racing. Fight or flight? I was trapped in the back seat, and this guy was twice my size. He parked the car and got out, leaving the engine running. I watched as another set of headlights appeared in the distance, getting closer. My stomach turned to ice. Another car pulled up, and 2 men stepped out. They were talking to the driver, laughing and gesturing toward the car, toward me. I don't know what came over me, but adrenaline took over. I started kicking the back seat window with everything I had. The first few kicks did nothing, but I didn't stop. Finally, the glass cracked, and I shoved my foot through, ignoring the sharp edges cutting into my leg. The men outside noticed the noise and started yelling. I didn't care. I crawled through the shattered window, landing hard on the gravel, and took off running into the trees. I didn't have a plan, just run. My chest was burning, branches were slapping my face, but I didn't stop. Then, in the distance, I heard sirens. I almost cried. Mark must have called the local police and sent them my location. The sound of the sirens startled the men, and I heard the cars speeding off behind me. I stumbled out of the trees and onto the main road, waving my arms like a madman. The police found me minutes later, bleeding and shaking, but alive. They told me they'd been chasing reports of illegal taxi scams and human trafficking in the area. Apparently, I'd narrowly escaped something far worse than just a robbery. I spent the rest of the night at the police station, filing reports and calling Mark to thank him for saving my life. To this day, I don't take shared rides. Ever. And if I'm ever traveling alone again, you'd better believe everyone I know will have my location on speed dial. Looking back, I can't help but think about how easily things could have gone differently. That driver, that laugh. It still haunts me. I don't know who those men were or what they had planned, but I'm grateful every day that I'll never have to find out. I don't really remember why I decided to stay in that hostel. I guess I just wanted to save some money. Berlin's not exactly cheap when you're traveling on a budget, and shared rooms seemed like the way to go. I'd done it before. Stay in hostels, meet other travelers, share stories. But this time was different. It started out normal enough. I checked into a small, run-down hostel not far from Kreuzberg. The place had charm, in the way that old, poorly lit places sometimes do. My room was a 6-bed dorm, but only one bed was occupied when I walked in. Sitting on the lower bunk at the far end of the room was this older guy, maybe in his late 50s, gray hair thinning on top. He didn't say much. Just nodded, looked down at his shoes, and kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. At first, I thought nothing of him. Weird hostel roommates are a part of the experience, right? Some people are social, others keep to themselves. That's how it goes. I dumped my backpack on my bed, which was right by the door, and went out for the day. Walked the city, grabbed a currywurst, hit a couple of museums. Normal stuff. When I got back to the hostel that night, it was late, around midnight. The room was dark, except for the dim glow of a streetlight filtering through the thin curtains. I tried to be quiet as I kicked off my shoes and slid into bed. That's when I noticed him. My roommate was awake. He was sitting up in his bunk, knees to his chest, just staring into the darkness. His face was turned toward me, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I could feel them on me. A shiver ran through my spine, but I shook it off. Hostile weirdos, I told myself. It's part of the deal. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up to the strangest feeling, like someone was watching me. You know that instinct, when your body knows something isn't right before your brain does. That's what it was. My eyes fluttered open, and for a second, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There he was. My roommate. Standing right next to my bed. His face was pale in the moonlight, and his hands were at his sides. One hand held something, a long, shiny object that caught the faint glow from the window. It was a knife. I froze. My heart was slamming against my ribcage so hard I thought he might hear it. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, holding that knife, his eyes wide and unblinking. Then he spoke, softly, like he didn't want to wake anyone else up. I just want to talk. Those words shouldn't have been scary, but coming from him, standing there like that, they sent ice down my spine. My mind raced. What the hell was I supposed to do? I couldn't scream. I didn't know how close he'd get with that knife. And honestly, I didn't even know what he wanted. So I forced myself to stay calm. Okay, I said, sitting up slowly, hands raised like I didn't want trouble. We can talk, man. No problem. You wanna go to the lounge? Get some coffee or something. For a second, I thought he might say no. His fingers tightened around the handle of the knife, his shoulders twitching. He looked at me like he was trying to figure something out, maybe whether he could trust me. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he mumbled. I slid off the bed, moving slow, like one wrong move would set him off. He stepped aside to let me pass, but he stayed close behind as I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. It was empty, the air cold and still. I glanced at the dim light down the corridor. The reception desk wasn't far. I had to make a choice. Hey, I'll grab us some water from reception, I said casually. Be right back. That's when I turned and ran. I sprinted down that hallway faster than I've ever run in my life. My bare feet slapped against the wooden floor, but I didn't care about the noise. I just ran. Behind me, I could hear him shout, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me. Stop, he screamed, voice shrill and angry. I just want to talk. I burst into the reception area, startling the night clerk, a young guy with headphones half on. I was gasping, pointing back toward the hallway, my words stumbling over each other. He has a knife. My roommate. He's coming. The clerk jumped up, his face turning pale as he processed what I was saying. He grabbed the phone to call the police just as my roommate appeared in the doorway to the reception area. His face was twisted, eyes wild, and that knife was still in his hand. "What the hell are you doing?" the clerk shouted, holding up a hand like that would stop him. My roommate didn't say anything this time. He just stood there, breathing hard, staring at me. Then, as suddenly as he had come, he turned and bolted out of the hostel's front door. The police arrived not long after. I sat in the lobby, wrapped in a blanket, hands shaking as I told them everything. They searched the hostel, asked questions, but the guy was gone. Vanished into the streets of Berlin like a ghost. They found his stuff still in the room, a duffel bag with clothes, a couple of toiletries, and a small notebook filled with strange scribbles. The weirdest part? He didn't have a reservation at the hostel. No ID, no check-in records, nothing. It's like he just showed up and decided to sleep there. The staff couldn't figure out how he'd gotten in, and honestly, neither could I. That night still haunts me. I think about it every time I stay in a hotel or hostel, every time I wake up in the dark and feel that split-second panic. What if I hadn't woken up? What if I hadn't stayed calm? I don't like to think about it. The police never found him, as far as I know. He's still out there somewhere. Maybe he's in another hostel, staring at another roommate in the dark, holding a knife, and whispering that he just wants to talk. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just an overnight train from Paris to Milan. I'd taken this route before, but something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the way the station lights flickered as the train pulled in, or the fact that my assigned compartment was empty, completely empty. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just my luck to have a quiet ride. The first few hours were uneventful. I stretched out on the seat, letting the rhythmic clatter of the train lull me to sleep. Somewhere around 2 a.m., though, I woke up to this faint sound. It wasn't the train or the wind, it was the sound of the door handle turning. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming. But when the door slid open, there he was. A man, maybe in his late 40s, standing in the doorway. He had a scruffy beard and was wearing this oversized jacket. He was holding a black backpack, and there was this weird smile on his face, like he wasn't surprised to see me there. "Hey," I said, sitting up quickly. "What are you doing here?" "This is my compartment." He didn't say a word. Just stepped inside like he belonged there. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. "You've got the wrong room," I said louder, hoping someone nearby would hear me. But the guy didn't even flinch. Instead, he closed the door behind him and reached for the lock. That's when I realized this wasn't just some drunk guy who wandered into the wrong compartment. He was trying to trap me in there with him. I shot up from my seat and grabbed the door handle before he could lock it. "Get out!" I yelled, but he just stared at me, still smiling. My voice must have carried because I heard someone shuffle in the hallway. The guy hesitated, glancing toward the noise. That split second was all I needed. I yanked the door open and started shouting, "Help! Someone, help!" A couple of passengers came running, and the man bolted past them, disappearing down the corridor. I was shaking, my hands still gripping the doorframe as if letting go would somehow let him come back. One of the passengers, a middle-aged woman, asked if I was okay. I could barely get the words out. "He tried to lock me in," I said. I don't know what he wanted, but he wouldn't leave. The train staff was called, and they searched the train, but the guy was gone. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I heard a noise, I jumped, thinking he was coming back. When we reached Milan, I reported the incident to the police. That's when I learned the truth. The man wasn't just some random creep. He was a thief who'd been targeting passengers on that line for weeks. Apparently, he'd sneak into compartments, lock the doors, and steal whatever he could while people were too scared to fight back. What terrified me the most was realizing how calculated he was. That smile wasn't just creepy, it was intentional. He wanted me to feel powerless, to second-guess myself long enough for him to take control. 4 weeks after that, I couldn't stop replaying the moment he stepped into the room. What if I hadn't woken up? What if I hadn't yelled for help? The what-ifs kept me up at night, long after the trip was over. I still take trains sometimes, but I never let my guard down. I always check the locks, keep my luggage close, and stay alert. That night taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself. It sneaks in quietly, with a smile, and you have to be ready to fight it off.